Hey everyone, it's Zach here. Today I'm going to walk through my experience writing my first policies to use with policy enforcement and integrate that into my Ansible Automation Platform workflows. So in my previous post, I actually walked through setting up an OPA server, which is going to be an important prerequisite to what I talk through today. And I'm going to kind of gloss over the server piece of things. So if you don't have an OPA server set up, go ahead and watch that one first, get it going, and then hop back into this video. So the first thing I want to do is give you guys a tour of the Rego playground. So Rego is the language or syntax that you're going to be leveraging to write policies for OPA server. And I highly recommend leveraging an LLM to help you get started if you don't have familiarity with Rego already. For me, it was a great use case for an LLM, right? Give me kind of a boost in productivity, get me 80% of the way there, and then I could kind of pick up the syntax and finesse it into the model that I wanted it to be for the integration into AAP. So I'm going to hop over into Rego Playground, and this is kind of always on sandbox for you to leverage. You can see here on the left, I've actually got a policy written out. There's a lot of comments. That's a feature or bug, if you will, of Cloud Code if you don't like comments, but always you could clean that up if you prefer less comments in your code. I personally left it in because I find it very useful for demo purposes. So on the left, you would have a working policy, right? And this playground allows you to quickly work through syntax issues and things along those lines and act and evaluate your policy against an input payload. So this evaluate button up here, my input payload is a legitimate payload that could come across the wire from AAP. And there's an example of that in the source code repository, which you can also tweak live in here to test out different values that you may anticipate coming through for your different use cases. So quickly, I'm going to walk through on the left what the policy actually looks like. So if I scroll down here, I've got some data that I'm setting up for what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to look to actually limit the extra variables that a user could pass into this job template. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm actually validate the values of one of those variables. So two separate things there, limiting the variables that are allowed, and then really honing in on one of those variables and limiting the values that a user could pass in. So where it gets really going is I've got this default block, and I'm defining a variable in Rego called TF Web Deploy, which is going to be important because that's going to be the name of the rule when we set it up in AAP. And by default, I'm setting the passing state, right? Because at this point, I haven't had any violations. So I'm going to set allowed true and then a list of violations to empty. And this is the response that AAP is going to be looking for. Really that allowed true or false. And then violations it will surface to the user, which is very useful as well. We scroll down here. I then have this step here where I'm actually extracting from the input a particular key. In this case, I'm looking at extra vars. So if you're familiar with the Ansible Automation Platform, extra vars are obviously an important part of how variables can be passed into a job run. So in this case, I'm going to pull those out so I can inspect them. I then have my first rule here where I'm going to go ahead and take a look at what keys are in this extra vars object and compare them against that setup that I have up top of the keys that I'm allowing. There's an important keyword here, contains, and I'll give another boost to LLM. So when I first wrote this out, my policy actually would only return to the user the last failed message. But in reality, I don't want my user to have to fix an issue, rerun everything, surface the new violation, rerun it again, until they have a complete clean solution. I'd rather just surface to them all the violations against the particular policy so they can implement fixes on their end all in one go. This contains allows me to do that. So I have a rule block here where I'm going to evaluate the keys, and if there are any violations, I'm going to add a violation message to that array. My next check here, you'll see I'm using contains again, but the result's going to be different, right? So this is the chance where I might add another violation message to this particular array, and you'll notice the if statement. So if the condition evaluates to true, it will set the violation message as an additional entry in that particular list. If it doesn't, it won't do anything. So we keep going down to the bottom, you'll notice this is where I'm actually setting the new result, and I'm only doing that if there are violations in my array. So if there aren't any, that default object gets returned and you're good to go. If there are any, we set allow to false, and then we return our list of violations. And again, that list will contain any violations that the input payload has, not just the last violation. So let's go ahead and test it out. I'm going to go ahead and click evaluate, and you'll see I've actually already have. So it returns a lot of information here, anything that you've set in the particular policy. But what's going to be important here is this TF web deploy, my allowed, false, and my violations. So in my input payload, if I scroll down and I find the extra vars, I just have example and value. If I scroll up on my policy, I'm looking for two particular keys. So an SSH public key and a VM size. Obviously, example doesn't fit either of those. So that was the violation that I've created. And you'll see here, I've got a nice friendly message. Disallowed extra vars provided, example, here are your allowed keys. So this is a good way to get quick feedback and test out your policies. I could also come in here and change this payload to see if I can pass the policy. Let's see if we click evaluate here. I changed it to an allowed key and I have no violations, right? That's great. I'm not necessarily requiring that they provide all variables. I'm just making sure they don't do anything outside of the scope. So let's try again and test out our other rule. So for Azure Web VM size, I have a set list of values, this standard DS1, DS2, or DS3. I'm just going to put in blah here. This should violate that policy, and you'll see that I do get a violation, right? So I've got blah provided for VM web size. It's not in the acceptable values. So the last thing I'll do is we want to test to make sure that we can provide, or that we can get a message for multiple violations. So let's change that to example. Click evaluate, scroll down, and again, you'll see we get a nice list of violations. So for me, this is kind of an optimal way that I intend to write my policies moving forward, where I can surface multiple violations for the rules that I'm interested in based on that incoming payload. And again, Rego Playground gives me a nice way to get that instant feedback. So next thing I want to do is hop over into Ansible Automation Platform and show you where you can actually configure this. So if we go into our settings and we've run the latest installer, if you don't see this, make sure you've run the latest AAP 2.5 installer to get the latest updates. In this automation execution section, we have a policy. Here I've set up the configuration to point at my OPA server. Again, take a look at my previous video if you don't have one of these up and running, but the configuration for me is pretty simple. And in that server, I am serving up the policies that we just walked through in the playground. So given that that is all running, I can come over here to a particular job template, which I've already set up to point at policy. So I'm going to come to this web demo deploy, let's go to edit template. And in this policy enforcement section, what's important here is that we have our package. So autodotes policy, which if you look at the source code, you'll see that's the name of the package. And then TF web deploy, which is important, right? It's the name of that return variable as well as the name of the file name, which is tf_web_deploy.rego in that particular package. And OPA is serving that up. So let me go ahead and click cancel. We're going to launch this. And we'll do a couple things. So first I'll put in a variable that is not allowed, right? And then let's go into, we know we're going to fail here, so I put in a bad SH key. Let's change this to X. So in theory, I should get multiple violations when this job launches. And of course I do. And that's the same message, right? We tested out in Rego Playground, and this automation is gated. So this is how you can apply policy within Ansible Automation Platform itself. And there are other levels as well where you can apply this. So you can apply it at the organization level as well as the inventory level, so that any jobs that run within those organizations can be tested against a policy or against a particular inventory. So it allows you to write policies for various levels within the automation. And I honestly expect there to be more features and capabilities to come in the future. But one thing I'll do is I'll come back over here and we'll rerun it, and we won't add any extra variables. We will give it and SH public key. This run will fail because it's a bad public key, but we should get through our policy gate. So we'll leave it as an acceptable size. I click finish, and we've got a running job. So I do expect this job to fail. I'll go ahead and cancel it because I gave it a bad public key. But the idea here was to show how you can set up policy enforcement with AAP, and then also how you can get started writing policies in Rego. As always, if you have any questions, drop a note in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for listening.